Okay, we are ready to start. Sorry about the technical difficulties. It's hard to find a room sometimes that's available because it's such a busy building here. Hi, Evelyn. I hope everyone can hear me. Let me know if you cannot. Okay, we are almost ready to start. Let me get my notes out. And be aware that there's a very yummy lunch after. Salad, sushi, wraps. I think there's sushi today.
Last week they
They didn't have. Are you came for the
That's when
sushi?
you don't come for lunch. The lunch was just.
You remind me that was last year, I teach seniors, and the parents don't tend to come to PTA. So what I did was, I bought a sushi platter, and I had it on my desk. It was amazing how many parents I had visiting me who I didn't even have their students. I didn't have their kids. But suddenly attended. Okay, so.
Because of the sushi.
Yeah, that they suddenly realized their kid might have me for a teacher in a year or so. Okay, guys, so welcome to our second week of myths and legends in Jewish history. Last week we looked at the very widespread myth, sadly untrue, that the Maharami Prague created a golem. Today we're going to look at another myth and legend that is absolutely fascinating. Is it true? Is it not? The idea that the Menorah, the temple candelabra, may in fact be hidden somewhere in the Vatican. So to begin, I wonder if this movie poster, evokes anything for any of you. Back in 1981, when I was a teenager, this was like the most popular movie ever. It was called Raiders of the Lost Ark. You might remember Harrison Ford. And the reason I put this up here is because this movie, which was totally fictional and a very colorful cartoon-like film, very popular, was supposedly the story of how an archaeologist played by Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, was on a quest to rediscover the Lost Ark, the lost Ark of the Jewish people that had been in the Beit HaMikdash. And it was a very exciting adventure story. What's amazing about this film, totally fictional, based on not even a kernel of historical truth, provoked such excitement and interest in archaeology that, everybody here, that all of a sudden the field of archaeology, and particularly biblical archaeology, was flooded with interest, with new applicants to various programs. Amazing how life imitated fiction here, and suddenly people were very intrigued by this question of what happened to the Lost Ark? The Ark of the Jewish people, and then there was discussion of the Lost Ark of Noah, and some of you might be familiar with the idea that Christian evangelicals in particular are also very fascinated by this question of biblical archaeology, because they too want to find proof that there is in fact remnants of the ancient Jewish people. The question of the menorah is an absolutely fascinating one. Is the menorah the candelabra of the Jewish people that has its origins back in the tabernacle? The menorah is based on a commandment that Moses was given before the Jews even entered the land. They were supposed to build, is there anybody here? They were supposed to build kalim, vessels for the tabernacle, which was a kind of temporary temple that traveled with the Jews. And the menorah, Moses was given very specific instructions. What happened to the menorah? We know that both in the first temple and the second temple, the Jews had their vessels. The second temple menorah was described as very beautiful, made out of gold, very valuable. And of course, you probably all know the story. What happened to the second temple? It was destroyed in 70 CE by Titus, Harasha, in Hebrew, Titus, the great Roman general, then later Caesar. What did he do with the kalim, the vessels of the holy temple? Well, we know he brought them into exile, and he brought them back with him to Rome. Later, as you know, Rome becomes the center for Catholicism, or Christianity, later for Catholicism. And the myth and legend has emerged, fascinatingly, in America and nowhere else, that the menorah is buried somewhere in the Vatican, and the church is holding on to it. The professor who has done the most work, last week we spoke about Sid Lyman, the great professor of Jewish history at Brooklyn College and at YU. This week our focus is going to be on a professor named Stephen Fine, who is the head of the Judaic Antiquities Department at Hebrew University. He's a tremendous expert in Jewish art and archaeology and visual history of the Jewish people in the ancient period. And he was fascinated by this myth. He had heard lots of stories. For example, in when was it? Just a few decades ago, we have the story of the Minister of Religious Affairs, Shimon Shitrit, meets with John Paul II. You might remember 1996, John Paul II was the Pope, somebody who was liberalizing the church and opening it up to the world and the good relations with the Jewish people. And the Minister of Religious Affairs actually goes over to John Paul II and says he asked the Vatican for cooperation in locating a gold menorah from the Second Temple period that was brought to Rome. Apparently, this like awkward silence ensued, and there was like no reaction on the part of the Pope. Tense silence emerges. Other stories. In 2004, one of the chief rabbis of Israel, on a historic visit to the Vatican, asks about the menorah, as did the president of Israel, Moshe Katsav, on another occasion. He asked for an official response, and Stephen Fein received from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs a confirmation this request was made. They have heard nothing yet back from the Vatican. What's fascinating is that when you look at myths and legends, for example, the Prague legend that we had last week, it seems to be universal. It seems to be found in all corners of the Jewish globe. Whether you live here in Israel, the Maharami Prague created a golem. But when it comes to the story of the menorah, it is fascinating that only in America do you have these legends emerging. So for the first time in Jewish history, we have folklore that is distinctly American only, did not come from Israel, did not come from any other part of Europe, does not go back, to the medieval period. It's a distinctly 20th century American invention. This idea that the Vatican is hiding the menorah. Now, what is the power of this myth? Where does it come from? And I think for this, we need to have a little bit of background in the significance of the menorah. Let me make this large. I hope everybody at home can hear me, the 7 of you at home. Okay, what is the significance of the menorah?
Did they ever? The Vatican ever answer?
The Vatican said, yes, so the Vatican representative said there is no evidence. Shepard, the Minister of Religion, he even quoted, he said, I found out from the University of Florence that research was done, they have evidence. Stephen Fein followed up on this. Nobody in the University of Florence ever heard of this. No work was done. And the Vatican keeps saying, no, we don't. There are even comical stories of Jewish tourists who were told by the rabbis, you're going to the Vatican, ask them where the menorah is. And they actually have cases where these priests, were approached by Jews in the Vatican saying, my rabbi at home told me to ask, where is that menorah? It's ours. We want to know where it is. Obviously, no response was given. Why? Because I think, without giving away the whole secret here, I think you might get a sense of where this is going. But let's see. Let's talk about the menorah. Let's leave the question hanging for a minute. Where is the menorah?
Why would this be an American?
So Stephen Fein says, I have no idea why it's developed here in America. We could venture to guess, I would think, that because the American Jewish community is very vocal, they're among the proudest, strongest Jewish communities in the world. And, American Jews have a sense of entitlement. I go to Israel, I'm a big machar. I know someone who knows someone. And I think American Jews just have this, if it's there, we want it, and we're vocal about it, and confident enough to say, where is it? But it is fascinating that you don't have it emerging anywhere else. And you have lots of stories. Even when I tell my students, will even say, well, yeah, we've heard, my mother said, when she goes to Italy, she heard, we want to know if it's there or not. It's amazing. It's only an American myth. It's not found in the collections of Jewish folklore. Stephen Fein went to the Hebrew University, looked at all the collections of Jewish folklore, found it nowhere else but here. All these stories emerging from American tourists. It's fascinating.
You think
Yes.
the Vatican's lying?
I don't. And we'll see why. We'll see why. Now, why does the myth emerge? So let's take a look at the menorah. Is everyone familiar with this little piece of a picture? Anybody been to Rome? And has anyone seen or is anyone familiar with? This is a detail from a relief on the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus, one of the greatest tourist attractions in Rome, is part of a big triumphal arch erected in honor of Titus about 10 years after his victory against the Jews. So just to orient ourselves in time, the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. In 71 CE, Titus has a triumphal processional march in Rome. And 10 years later, to commemorate that great victory against the Jews, they were one of the few people who had the nerve to revolt against Rome. And this was a revolt that took years for the Romans to suppress and at great cost. To commemorate that great victory, commissioned a triumphal depiction of what happened when Titus comes back to Rome. And what do you see here? This is one of the most famous visual images in Jewish history. You see here, carved on the Arch of Titus, a depiction of Roman soldiers carrying some of the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash of the Second Temple into Rome. Among them, you can see horns, chatzotzrot. You can see some of the vessels related to the shulchan. These were sacrifices that were done, where the lechem hapanim, there was bread that was baked daily, and you see the trays, you see the chatzotzrot. Most significantly, of course, taking pride of place, right here in the center, is the menorah, the candelabra. Now, so much to say about this menorah. First of all, did you know, if I were to ask you, what is the most important Jewish symbol? What might you answer?
Jewish star.
The Jewish star. Do you know that the Jewish star does not go back to ancient times? It only emerges as a Jewish symbol sometime in the Middle Ages. It formerly was not a Jewish symbol, and only somehow, in a very interesting kind of evolution, the Magen David becomes a symbol of Judaism. Do you know what the oldest continuously existing religious symbol of any religion in Western history is? The menorah. The menorah is ancient. It goes back to Mosaic times. It becomes such an important symbol of Jewish sovereignty, of Jewish religion, that it will be put on coins, it will be put on furniture. It appears everywhere in the ancient Jewish world. Now, take a look at this menorah. So much to discuss here. Can you count how many candles it has? 7, right? Mm-hmm. So let's just to clarify something, because one of my students asked me such a good basic question. That's the candelabra, the menorah, famous for the temple. Here's the menorah we like today. What's the difference? Mm-hmm. Right? You actually have 8 plus 1, you have 9. What's the difference? So the answer is very simple. Yes, this is supposed to evoke the temple menorah, but today, what became the custom? We light, and the halacha, we light 9 because we changed the shape of the menorah and how many candles to commemorate the great miracle of Hanukkah. So fascinating how the menorah evolves in history. Today we think of the menorah as 8 branches with a shamash, simply because of the holiday of Hanukkah. But let's go back for a moment to this image of the Arch of Titus. Has anybody been to Rome? Anybody? Yeah, have you seen the Arch of Titus? No, so you have to go back. You have to go back. Okay, so if the Arch of Titus famously looks like this, I'm going to show you something absolutely astonishing. Stephen Fine, as someone who's an expert in visual ancient art, understood that no one would build a boring arch in shades of gray, right? Color was used in ancient Rome. The problem is that over the years, the color was, washed away, faded away. And so he got a big grant from some organization, and using his students and using research, he discovered, using, I don't even know what the words are, infrared, optometry, all kinds of new sciences, they discovered what the original colors of the Arch of Titus were, and they created this amazing exhibit a few years ago, which I took my class to see, and using 3D whatever, you're looking at a model of the Arch of Titus, and suddenly it bursts into color. You're not going to believe what it actually looked like. This is what the Arch of Titus looked like originally, almost cartoon-like in its vivid colors. This is what ancient Roman monuments look like, not those, our eyes are so accustomed to marble busts and everything shades of gray and white. This is the colorful, real view of the Arch of Titus. You can see much more clearly, of course, all of the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash. So the menorah is a very, very old, ancient Jewish symbol that then plays a great role in the recreation of the Jewish state. When the Jewish state emerges in the 20th century, the idea is, what are we going to use as a symbol to evoke the Jewish past while also looking at the Jewish future? And the answer is the menorah. The menorah. We're going to come back to this in a moment. But first, I have a mystery for you. Okay, what are you looking at here, guys? A Chabad candle lighting. I'm sure if you've been anywhere in the world around Hanukkah time, if you are Grand Army Plaza or anywhere in the world where there is a Chabad Shaliach, you will see Chabad members lighting a menorah that looks like this. What's the problem? Anybody? It's a completely different shape than the menorah we are accustomed to using. And you will never find, look at this, the menorah here, always depicted as curved, and yet the Chabad menorah looks like this. What's going on here? This is a fascinating discussion in and of itself. The Lubavitcher Rebbe uses what you said, a straight lines menorah. Why? Anybody know, is there any reason to depict a menorah like this? The answer is yes. I wonder if you know, Todd. My father knows. Which halachic authority actually drew a picture in a medieval manuscript on his commentary to the Mishnah, in which he said, as an educational tool, I want to illustrate what the menorah looked like. And he drew a menorah with straight lines. Good, Rabbi Maimonides, the great scholar of the 12th century. My mother learned to daven. You see that? She showed you up top. Those who know, that's my father. My mother made him come. So the Chabad menorah is based on Maimonides, actually in a manuscript we have on his commentary to the Mishnah, drew the menorah this way. Now, we have a problem. Maimonides is a very great scholar. Why then didn't we all start drawing the menorah this way or using a menorah that looks like that? Most people use the curved menorah. Controversy. Maimonides himself wrote, this is just intended, it's like a sketch. This is just intended as an aid for study, which means that he may have just loosely drawn a menorah just to illustrate how many times. It doesn't mean that he actually thought it looks like this. But what muddies the waters? His son, Abraham ben Maimon, writes that what my father depicted is true and not the rounded shape that everyone else says is the way the menorah looked like. Now, majority opinion today follows the rounded shape, and you would think that we have good evidence. Isn't the Arch of Titus, which depicts the menorah as it was stolen from the Beit HaMikdash, you would think it was right, but because Maimonides has great weight in the Jewish world, there are some who still follow him based on his son's assertion that what my father wrote is correct. Stephen Fine goes on to say, fascinating, a little side point here, that there's a specific reason why the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last and final, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, why did he insist on this menorah? So first of all, Maimonides is very important in the teachings of Chabad, very important, but there's more to it than that. What do you know about Lubavitch, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe? What was the whole, still controversial to this day. There's a lot of discussion about him as the Mashiach, right? The movement itself believed that he was a Chabad. Thousands of Chabad Hasidim, many still believe in that he is the Messiah. And what Stephen Fine points out, that the Rebbe was very clear. He said, the menorah on the Arch of Titus is not Jewish. He says, you're looking at a menorah made by Goyim, for Goyim. You can't trust that. I trust Maimonides, but more than that, says Stephen Fine, you can see the messianic ideas around this. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, in a sense, was claiming for himself absolute halachic authority. We're living in the Messianic era. We are soon going to restore the third temple. The menorah is a symbol of Jewish sovereignty. I, Lubavitcher Rebbe, who my Hasidim believe, and there's a whole controversial story, the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself sees himself as a Messiah. There's some good evidence that he was continuing the family tradition. He may have, but in any case, he was taking for himself the authority to determine what the shape of the menorah would be. This is all part feeding into this messianic idea. The Mashiach is coming. It might even be me right now, and I get to determine the halachic parameters of the menorah. Question.
Sorry, isn't it very descriptive in the Torah?
Oh, excellent question. The menorah is a very interesting and detailed description, but it doesn't quite tell you if it goes like this or like this. And moreover, if you read the description, now I wanted to actually go back and read the original psukim. I did not have time. Stephen Fine points out that as descriptive as it is, it's unclear. Okay. It's unclear. There's a lot of detail, but it's he says it's almost incomprehensible. You need like the Meforshim to tease out. And there's something else which we need to talk about, which is absolutely fascinating. And that is, let us take a look at, let's go back for a moment, let us take a look at the menorah as depicted on the Arch of Titus. Now, I should have had a close-up here, but does anybody know what images are inscribed on the base of the menorah? I should probably find the blow-up, it'll take me too long. Okay, answer, pagan symbols. You have dolphins and like dragon-like creatures, symbols that Jews, what's the problem here? Did Jews incorporate images of idols or mythical creatures that reeked of idolatry? Absolutely not. So we have a problem. Can we trust that this menorah is actually the menorah taken from the temple and is an accurate depiction? We know it was taken. We know the vessels went into the look, but looking at the base, we have a problem. What's the story? Any thoughts on what? And we're going to intensify the problem by look at this. Recently, not that long ago, archaeologists have uncovered the oldest images of Minoras in Israel. This is found in the Galilean town of Magdala. And here you have something astonishing. They found a depiction of a menorah on a table that was used for Torah readings. And look at the base. The base, again, it's a little hard to see because it's blown up. The base does not have that big giant base that's three-dimensional, a hexagonal shape. Instead, it has like a tripod. There's a tripod and it rests on some sort of cube. Interesting, an even older depiction, probably the oldest depiction of a menorah in Israel is this. Wow. And here too, by the way, we see the curved shape, but we do not see that big base. Solution. Do we simply say, oh, then the Arch of Titus cannot be showing us the real menorah? Or do we say very simply what most historians assume, which is, what do you think? What do you think might have happened? Anyone?
The Hellenized.
The Romans, either the base got damaged, destroyed, or maybe they used the gold and melted it down, very valid. Or in order to show that their victory was so great, and in order to kind of rub salt in the wounds of the Jews, not only do we have their vessels, but we're now going to show it on a Roman idolatry-filled symbols of Roman pagan culture. And so it's very possible that the Arch of Titus simply depicted a menorah on a Roman-style base, but the menorah itself was in fact the vessel of the Beit HaMikdash. That in fact makes the most sense. Now, who else talks about having these vessels taken to Rome? And here we come to one of the most fascinating, colorful, and controversial personalities in ancient Jewish history. This man probably is not really an accurate bust of who he was, but we use it for illustrative purposes. This man is, well, you tell me, anybody know who was an ancient Jewish historian? Josephus, huh? Oh my, I did not hear the answers. Extra credit for you. You're going to get extra sushi at lunch if they have sushi. This is Josephus, the great ancient Jewish historian. Does anybody know a little bit about Josephus? We'll give you a little background. Fascinating stuff. When the Jews revolted in Rome, against Rome, I should say, in 67 CE, Josephus was a young man who came from an aristocratic background. He had spent time in Rome. He was very smart, comes from a distinguished lineage. He was appointed commander of the Galilean forces against Rome. Sadly, you all know the end of the story, the Jews lost. But Josephus goes on to, he's captured by the Romans. He becomes friendly with Vespasian at the time, the father of Titus, at the time the general against the Jewish forces. He is taken as a prisoner of war, but treated with respect. He then goes on after the war. He goes on to Rome, settles there, still a religious Jew, but he's granted a kind of stipend, if you will, by Titus. He's friendly with him, close with him, and he goes on to write some of the most important books in ancient Jewish history. He writes an entire history of the Jews. He writes a war against the Jews that is still very popular. We read it on Tish B'Av. Many people like to read it because he gives you an eyewitness account of what happened. Here's the problem with Josephus. What did I just say? General of the Jewish army, taken captive by the Romans in a famous battle at Yodfat. If you go to Israel and the Galilee, you can take a tour and you actually get to see some of the weapons in the hills and you can actually reenact the war. But the amazing thing about Josephus and the controversial thing about Josephus is he goes over to the other side, so to speak. He becomes chummy with the Romans, and when he writes in his biography how he was saved from this war, how did he stay alive? He says something very interesting, and can we trust him is the big question. He's writing a book to make himself look good. He says that when he was in Yodfat, you have to understand the Jewish defenders of the city of Yodfat were going to give up their lives rather than be captured by the Romans. They were Jewish nationalists. He said, Josephus, I figured the battle is lost. Let's just surrender so at least we'll stay alive. And then we could try to convince the Jews to put down their arms. They say to him, if you do that, we're going to kill you. He says, okay, no problem. They're hiding in a cave. And the Romans are on top of they find that, but the Romans can't take them out because if they go down, they're just going to kill each Roman as they come in. But how long can they stay there? Josephus tries to convince them, let's leave, let's surrender. No, we'll kill you if you do this. Okay, no problem. I have an idea, he writes in his biography. We're going to make a circle. We're going to start at the circle. Every person, when we start with number 1, is going to count 2 over, kill them, And then we're going to move around the circle until the last two people are left standing. One will kill the other will kill himself, and then we'll die free men. Well, says Josephus, we went around the circle, and guess who was left standing? Me and someone else, and I convinced that man they're better to surrender to the Romans. To this day, people have been arguing about whether or not we can trust Josephus. How interesting is it that a guy who was ready to compromise the Romans somehow ends up in the suicide pact? He is alive. Guys, fascinating. It goes down as a math problem. Was Josephus smart enough to figure out the math formula for how can you come out alive using x plus y plus 3? I don't know math, you can tell. But it actually goes down in math as the Josephus problem. Look it up. It is theoretically possible if he was so smart that he figured out the geometric or calculus equation how he could be left standing.
How many people were involved?
I forget that you can look at the stories, like probably 20 some men. I would imagine like more than a dozen, under 20. I don't remember the specific numbers. Look it up, the Josephus problem. Totally fascinating. I give it to the math teacher to do with their advanced math students, and the kids go crazy. You can look at ancient Jewish history and look at something. In any case, Josephus is a slippery guy. He's writing for a dual audience. On the one hand, he wants to show the Jews that Titus, the Romans are not so bad. And really, for example, he writes, who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash? We all know, we've learned since we're in first grade, that Titus, that evil man, commanded them to burn down the Beit HaMikdash. That's a fact, or is it? Josephus says Titus said, no, the temple is so special, we want to preserve it, we're not that terrible. But some anonymous Roman soldier threw his torch into the Mikdash and it went up in flames. See how he tries to get away with that? So Stephen Font says, do we trust Josephus, who tells us that all of the temple treasures, and here I'm just quoting from some of his books, since we're running out of time, I'll do this quickly, but he says that the temple treasures, he writes, he was an eyewitness. They all showed up.
This is the Talmud
Oh,
him.
Good. They don't, the
bring a lot of
Talmud,
history based on.
right, so the Talmud, I don't know that the Talmud discusses Josephus at length, but the Talmud also has, we're going to get to it, some midrashic accounts of first century, second century rabbis who actually were eyewitnesses in Rome, because many of the rabbis traveled to Rome, either taken captive or traveled to Rome. But that's an interesting question that I would pursue further. Does the Talmud have anything to say about Josephus? I wonder. And the Medrash is actually mentioned by name. That's the students' realm, not ours. We still have 10 more minutes. So Josephus, so here's what Stephen Fine says, and it's an actually fascinating point. When it comes to his personal life, and when it comes to exaggerating things about the Romans and showing the Jews the Romans are not so bad, because remember, Josephus, he's getting paid by the Romans. He's friends with the Romans. He gets a villa in Rome. So he has to show the Romans in a good light. At the same time, he's also writing to the Romans to show the Jews. He keeps saying, oh, most of the Jews are ready to compromise, like me. Really, it's just the hotheads who wanted to wage war. So he said, so there we don't know that we can trust him. We don't know. But what archaeology has borne out is that everything Josephus describes to us physically about the layout at Jerusalem, the Galilean wars, every single thing he has said about it has been borne out by archaeological studies. In other words, when he gives you depictions of the wars and what was taken and what happened, who fought and strategies, that seems to be highly accurate. Therefore, we have no reason to disbelieve his account that the spoils were taken to Jerusalem. Now, he does point out in Menorah he was puzzled by the base, which leads us to suggest, what most people say, is that the Romans created an alternate base that would, again, rub salt in the wounds of the Jews. Not only do we have your temple, the Menorah, we're putting it on a base that's full of pagan symbols. And that makes the most sense, if you will. So, in addition to Josephus, and Josephus also explains to us, this is what a rendering of what the Temple of Peace will have. Where was the Menorah actually displayed? We know, and there's archaeology to bear this out, that the Emperor Domitian, his younger brother, after Titus, built this Temple of Peace where all of the spoils of war and statues and so on were displayed. It was supposed to be this magnificent edifice. We have the archaeological remnants of it. And we know that that's likely where the Temple of Peace was, actually I should say, it was may have been completed later, but Vespasian, the father of Titus, the one who had fought the Jews initially, he actually began the building of this Temple of Peace. We have no reason to disbelieve Josephus. In addition, there are hints in rabbinic literature. We know that lots of rabbis were taken prisoner by the Romans, and they ended up in Rome, and others after the destruction of the temple. What's interesting is, my students are always surprised by this, but after a few years, things were not so bad anymore. And rabbis would travel frequently from Eretz Israel to Rome, and we have the accounts of a second century Rabbi Shimon, who says, when I went to Rome, there I saw the Menorah. Do we have any reason to disbelieve it? Again, let's put all the pieces of evidence together. The Romans did sack the temple. They did bring the vessels, lots of eyewitness accounts, including Josephus. And here you have rabbis with no reason to lie to say, I saw the temple Menorah. In addition, gets a little later in Jewish history. Well into the Middle Ages, we have accounts of travelers who make the claim that they can see it themselves, but they heard the communities of Jews living in Rome alluding to legends. Anybody ever hear of Benjamin of Tudela? Benjamin of Tudela is a very famous medieval traveler in the 12th century who gets to Rome and he hears the community chatting about, and he hears Christians as well. There's this idea that the temple treasures are still somewhere in Rome. But by the 12th century, no one has seen it. So what's the story? I promise that we have an answer to this question. And the answer to this question, as Stephen Farn says, I hate to disappoint everyone, but all those rabbis telling their constituents, go ask the Vatican where it is. Because you know what happened? Anybody know what happened to Rome in the 5th century? It was sacked by the barbarians. It was sacked by the Visigoths, followed by the Vandals. And I took one illustration here because you can see what's going on. When Rome had become too bloated, corrupt, probably like that before the Roman Empire. So in 410 and decades later as well, Rome was sacked by barbarians. And what are they looking for? They're looting Rome. So I like this one because it shows you what probably happened. Very disappointing. But the probably best answer, despite all the myths and legends that it was buried in the river and then it went to the Byzantine Empire, zero evidence, archaeological, literary, anything, that the Menorah was anything but disappeared in history. Why? Because it was made out of gold. And what we know, when looting armies come, what do they do with gold? They cart it off and they melt it down. So it's demonized that perhaps a small comfort, maybe you and I are wearing jewelry that might somehow, after 2,000 years, include some of the gold melted in the Beit HaMikdash. But there's one other thing that I want to,
Yes. Where do barbarians come from?
Oh, so that's a good question. So there are many different barbarian tribes. We have the Visigoths, we have the Goths, we have the Gauls. They're coming from other parts of Europe, and they look at the Roman Empire as ripe for the picking, which it was. Each barbarian tribe ends up somewhere else. So, for example, the Visigoths end up in Spain, and the Saxons end up in what is today England. But they're coming out of different parts of Europe, sweeping through Italy, attacking the Roman Empire falls. That's why we have the emergence of the Middle Ages, the emergence of modern nation states. Each barbaric tribe settles in a different area of the former Roman Empire. One final observation, and then we shall stop and go for lunch. I feel bad somebody missed the whole class. Okay. Okay, take a look here. Let's go back to the original. Let's take a look at the colorful image. Throughout Jewish history, the idea was that, well, you tell me, who's depicted here carrying the menorah? Obviously, it's Roman soldiers. But what's fascinating is that beginning in the Middle Ages and up until today, certain areas of Israel, these began to recast the Arch of Titus as showing not Roman soldiers carrying the menorah into exile, but rather the Jews themselves. And they began to portray, this is incorrect, but nevertheless, they began another myth attached to it, that really the Arch of Titus shows we Jews, even though we've been defeated, we are carrying the menorah into exile, and one day we shall reclaim it. Which brings me to a lovely story, a true story. And I think it's a nice way to end. We don't know where the menorah is, but if you think about the menorah as a symbol of Jewish people, we are living menorahs. And there's a beautiful story told about the great Rosh Yeshiva, Ty, you'll correct, Yosef, is it Yosef Kahaneman? He was the great Rosh Yeshiva, the great Yeshiva of Panovich. And he would go fundraising throughout the world. There's a fabulous story told about him, true. I was able to ascertain that in fact this was not a native story. He went to Rome one day. This was not a man interested in Jewish history or ancient archaeology, and he insisted on a cold, wet day, he insisted that his students bring him to the Arch of Titus. And they're like, why are you going to Arch of Titus? He says, take me there. He gets out of the car, he stands under the Arch of Titus, and he starts to we. And he says, I would say very emotional, I say it's so beautiful. He says in Yiddish, he says, Titus, Titus, wo bist du? Where are you? And he says, wir sind du. Titus, Titus, ephorta anachnu po. You Titus, you Romans, where's the glory of your empire? You're left on an arch. We are here today. So the menorah might be here. It might be in the river somewhere. It might be melted down. It probably was melted down. But no, nevertheless, the symbol of the menorah lives on in each of us. And one day soon, hopefully, we will have the actual physical menorah reconstituted, minus its pagan symbols, in Jerusalem.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you. Wow.
I hope everybody was able to hear this at home. Thank you so much.